Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. Jim Colangelo with State of Michigan. Thanks for joining today. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role with the State of Michigan?
Sure, thanks. I'm Jim Colangelo. I am the Chief Procurement Officer for the State of Michigan. I have been in this role for 4 years now. Actually, on January 2nd was my 4-year anniversary. So I am essentially responsible for a large portion of our state procurement activities. We are more or less centralized, at least from a policy procedure perspective. We have, ultimate procurement authority over all of our state agencies in one form or another, with the exception of a couple that have some statutory authority for certain things like roads, and over at the Department of Transportation and similar things like that. So yeah, that's me.
Good. Well, so, Michigan was recognized by governing in 2019 as one of the top 5 programs. I don't remember the exact number, but and then I've actually referenced certain things in your program different times, like the contract management and some other pieces. So what are some of the things that you're most proud of that Michigan's been doing that were honored in that way? And what are some of the lessons that others can apply, whether they're states or other levels of government?
A couple of things off the top of my head would be our ability to track metrics, and not just cost savings, but in pretty much every way you can imagine. We track about 40 different key performance indicators across our department. A lot of that is around our sourcing team and their lead times for all the different types of solicitations that we do, not just RFPs, but every change notices and from the big stuff to the small stuff. And while we don't link our individuals' performance reviews and such to those key performance indicators, everyone is measured on them. And that trickles up. So from an individual level up to a department level. So we have, say, our IT sourcing team, our commodities or services. Those are our 3 main kind of sourcing categories. They're all measured at their kind of group level, but also down to their individual level. So they have some responsibility there. But with that, responsibility and measuring of those numbers came the ability to execute on projects without a lot of oversight, meaning we gave our sourcing folks what we call signature authority, which basically means they can execute contracts up to a certain level without going through multiple tiers of approvals. So that decreased our sourcing time overall quite a bit, and helped our metrics and move our numbers up for the entire group, but also helped our culture along quite a bit in terms of people feeling that they owned and were responsible for their projects, and the quality of the work increased significantly at that point. So a couple of things tied in here, just a quick recap. So we started measuring our data and said, look, you're going to be measured on this data, everyone. But also here's how you can control that. And here's the responsibility for those things. So at first, there was a lot of concern among staff, like, hey, you're measuring me on something that I may not have full control over. It's not always my fault that a project takes a long time. And we understand that. We have, mechanisms in place to, kind of either remove or adjust major outliers of certain projects. But giving people the ability to own their portfolio completely, and have full responsibility for it really helped move our culture of kind of empowerment and customer service, which is a key component to how we operate in procurement in the state of Michigan. You know, customer service is our real #1 priority. And that was something that we were recognized for, not just our KPIs, but our attrition rate went from, so we were up in the high 30s, we're now at the less than 5%. You know, people are happier. So we recognize for our low attrition, our KPIs, our, you know, ability to, again, keep our customers really happy, while at the same time having those hard conversations around, you know, how long things are going to take. And so those are just some of the things that we're pretty proud of there.
Well, that's really interesting. So let's let's stick in that a little bit. So you helped me capture your org chart and your approach to organization for an alignment and reorganization project I helped with for a peer earlier in the year. And I would say, you know, out of all of the org charts that I collected, yours was fairly unique in the way that you sort of showed, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit here, right? But that you showed kind of the major lines of work, and then how each one of your subsections, sort of how you visualized rolling them up. So was that initial organization, was that organizational design that I saw, was that a component of that culture change that you talked about? Did you drive that at some point in your comment?
Yeah. So that was probably, it's probably the not just a component of the culture change, but it was a cornerstone of it. So, you know, when you come into an organization that is maybe floundering or just kind of going along and just doing okay, but not great, you know, your first reaction is to, you know, want to change your org chart, your structure, maybe switch some people around. And my approach was sort of like that, but the first thing I did was take stock of essentially who I had on my team. And I don't want to say I interviewed everyone on my staff, but, and by the way, I have about 60 folks that work directly for me. I sat with all of them for about a half an hour, and it was more just a conversation like, hey, how are you? How have things been? What can you tell me about your work? What do you like about it? What would you like to change about it? Some folks were more open than others. You know, this is like trust issues in leadership a lot of times. But it gave me a really good indicator as to how the office not just had been running before, but how people were feeling about their jobs generally. And what I realized was I had an entire section of the office who were not doing sourcing work directly, but were doing really, really important work to make sure that sourcing was going well, and not having any sort of either direction, recognition, any formal job titles. They had no management structure. It was just kind of this floating back office of 30 people. Some were doing one job, some were doing 8 jobs, and dabbling a little bit in each one. So what I was able to do is take some experience and other ideas that I had in some private sector jobs that I had prior to coming to the state, and say, look, you know, first of all, our core mission is customer service. We are a customer service organization, and that's the end of it. So, you know, we do other things. We save money. We do all the, you know, your general like procurement 101. This is what you should be doing. But that's never been nearly as important to me, because I have found that when you have an empowered workforce and you have a culture that promotes customer service, all those other things that you want to measure as a procurement professional and you will get fantastic results, like great cost savings. So essentially what I did was build up a customer experience side of the house. So I've got the sourcing side, which already kind of existed, and I had all my sourcing professionals over there. And then I stood up customer experience side and created a director position there that oversaw all those people, and also was able to create, managers and other folks in there, and tasked all of these people with specific roles around, creating and tracking our metrics, which was very important again. Contract management, training and certification. We built a whole program with the team that we had built up there, and there's several other things in that bucket too. But basically, I was able to do this with all the existing people that I had on my staff. They just hadn't been given any guidance to do this kind of work. They were just floating along and kind of doing a job. So by creating that group and saying, okay, back office, you're no longer back office, you're elevated to the same level as the sourcing team, because they're symbiotic, right? You can't have a good sourcing team without a good support team, and vice versa. So sourcing people can't do their jobs without the customer experience team. And so building that culture around that half of the office, and also letting the sourcing people know that these back office / customer experience team is just as important as they are, was a little bit of a culture shift. But once we got there, it's really been, the results have been fantastic. And I would mirror this exact setup that I have here, or close to it, depending on another organization, if I were to move on somewhere else. It's been so good.
So, so staying still in the topic. So, using KPIs is something that I hear a lot that people want to do. And of course, everybody does some level of KPIs, right? But to some degree, our ability to do KPIs is affected by how well our data actually supports it, right? Or whether we're doing some of those marks to be able to track. And I see sometimes these projects get a little into an analysis paralysis place of they want to, but it's hard to begin. So if you were beginning a program, right, and you weren't sure of all of your data sources or whatever, I mean, what is some advice of the first 2 or 3 ways to try to build a beachhead to start working on, to be able to start creating that culture, even if you can't get to the full maturity level in the first jump?
Yeah, and we didn't. So we started out with 5 KPIs, and that was a really big deal. And what we had to do there, so first bit of advice is start small. You can start with 1 or 2. What you want to do though is pick KPIs that you can measure accurately. So what you said is right. You don't want to be in this analysis paralysis where you're trying to figure out 30 KPIs and how you're going to get those numbers. Don't worry about that. Just talk to your staff, figure out kind of where they're comfortable in measuring certain things, and just draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we're going to measure cost savings. Well, decide what you're going to measure. Second thing is define it, right? And define it very clearly, but also very simply. There was a cost savings definition that I can't even remember anymore. That was so complicated that no one really understood it. It was just all kinds of, formula and all this stupid stuff. It didn't make any sense to anyone, so no one measured it. So we redefined cost savings, and we also went a little bit further and said, are we going to measure and report on hard savings or soft savings, right? Again, keeping it simple, all Procurement 101 stuff. And we said, look, we're going to measure both hard and soft savings, but we're only going to report out on hard savings, because at the end of the day, the hard savings outside of your office, of a procurement office, nobody understands well or cares about soft savings, especially when you're in the government and you're talking to legislators. You can't explain to them in any kind of simple term what a soft saving is. So we just measure, report out in all our reports, hard savings only. So
So
that's kind
was your hard saving, so was cost avoidance part of hard savings, or was that part of
of
soft savings?
soft savings.
So how do you affect then hard savings from a procurement organization, because the budget is in the agency, right? So like if you save 15% on pencils and you enable the agency to buy a fifth pencil when they only had budget for four,
Mhm.
so where does your hard savings, what you give us a definition from your perspective of what hard savings is?
Well, so what we would say, in that case, if we put that contract in place for that agency,
Mm-hmm.
that's our savings. And we do most of the contracts statewide. So the agencies have about $500,000 of authority where they can go and contract out on their own. And most of them do not measure savings. So, we'll measure them on our contracts on what we say our DTMB, technology management and budget, which is where my department sits at the state. So, we would measure that for our contracts only, and the numbers are still, they're very, very good. But, one of the things we always say too is the numbers are the numbers. And it sounds really simple to say that, and it is simple to say that, but there's an understanding that goes with that. If you set a savings target, which, by the way, this is the other piece of shifting gears just slightly, really quick for a second. When you're talking about KPIs, you do want to set goals and you want to set targets, but they need to be realistic. And what we did when we first set up our KPIs was look at our historical data and see where we landed for the last like 2 to 3 years on some of this stuff. So we would apply our cost savings methodology or our length of time for an RFP, which was also one of the first KPIs. How long did an RFP take on average the last couple of years? And then let's apply our model to that and look at, and then we set a goal. Okay, we're going to say 128 days, business days will be how long an RFP takes. And what we want to do is hit that number 70% of the time. So that's our KPI for that. Cost savings. How much did we save? Well, I know the formula was weird. If you remember, earlier I said the formula was completely jacked up, didn't really make a lot of sense. So we just took a subset of contracts, extrapolated that number, applied our very simple methodology of, what a cost savings is. Essentially, you're saving money over a previously contracted price, or, when you're looking at a new contract for the bids coming in, what the budget is to actual. That's a very simple definition. But that's how we measure our hard savings. And so we would kind of extrapolate that number, and our first cost savings target, I think, was like $8 million. And that was 2.5 years ago, maybe almost closer to 3 years now. Because it took about 6 to 8 months to kind of set a lot of this stuff up. And so now this past year, we saved $21 million. So, what's our goal going to be for next year? Probably not $20 million, maybe 15, maybe 18. So we don't necessarily base our savings numbers and our savings targets on prior year's spend. We look at kind of what's coming down the pipeline and also realistic numbers.
Well, and what a year, right? Like, who knows if
Right.
historical spend is going to be meaningful right now. So, and we'll touch on COVID in a second.
Sure.
But you actually hit on some where I was going to go next when you were describing that. So that one of your early KPIs was the time to do an RFP.
Yeah.
So before the holidays, I started a content arc around procurement agility, right? And I mean, one of the common complaints that you hear from vendor community is that the RFPs are large and ponderous and hard to respond to, and et cetera. And I'm certainly not going to bury the RFP, because there are definitely times where it is exactly the right tool, and despite protests to the alternative, it's an effective tool. But it's not the only tool, right? There are different
Mhm.
tools in the toolkit. There are different ways to go to market. There are different ways to think about vendor pools with small form SOWs. There are ways to think about challenge bids or problem statement style bids. There's lots of things that people are playing with. So, how do you try, when I say procurement agility to you, does that have any does that spark any particular thing that you're trying to do or work on, or how do you drive that understanding that the amount of time it takes to do an RFP is
Mhm.
also about like using the right tool when we're actually going to market?
So that's a great question. And yeah, so when we think about agility, for me, again, it goes back to customer experience or customer service. And like, who are our customers, right? Our customers are our agencies. Our customers are the citizens of the state. So me and everyone else that lives here, 10 million people. But the customers are also our suppliers. And
Mhm.
um, I look very much in our culture to make sure that we are treating our suppliers with respect and as partners where possible, where it makes sense. We do have some long-term partners, and this is where I run up against some what's the word I'm looking for? I wouldn't say opposition, but I get raised eyebrows, and I get some grinding against those words on the legislative side, like, no, you should only be buying the cheapest items. No, our suppliers are not our friends. No, we should put out to bid everything all the time. And I don't agree with any of those statements. Um, and I think there's some procurement folks that also don't agree with that. But I think your more advanced organizations realize that you're going to have long-term partnerships with some vendors. So again, circle back, customer experience. We are trying really hard to make sure that our vendors have a pretty easy time responding to our bids. And some of them are really long, and some of them need to be. But something that we've started to do is move to a more solutions-based bid, right? So a lot of times, especially again in government, much less so in the private sector, your bids are super prescriptive, right? They have requirements that are 10, 15, 20 pages long. We're now, especially in the IT space, we're moving to a more, what I would say is agile, requirements, or I'm sorry, solutions-based RFPs, responses. So what we say is, here's a problem, here's some loose requirements, these are kind of go, no go requirements. Meet these base ones, but then give us your creative solution as to how you would help the state achieve its goal, whatever that goal is in that bid. So that's one thing we're doing on the RFP side. So when we do have to do RFPs, we're trying to at least move to an easier kind of format and a more collaborative format. Also, under my organization, one of the tasks I gave to, I would say, one of the more creative people on my team, who was also an attorney, is to look at our procurement law. And, what exactly can we do or can't we do within the law? And essentially, the law states that we have to publicly post bidding opportunities. It doesn't say how we have to do that. We just happen to have an RFP and a couple of other bidding kind of
Instruments.
tools, mechanisms, right? We came up with a few more. And one of the complaints I had from IT was that they were not able to do any proofs of concept, because we had to have everything out on the street for a bid. They couldn't just try something out. So we created a bid package called a CPC, or a competitive proof of concept. Essentially an RFP that has a proof of concept built into into the back end of it. So essentially what we do is put out this CPC, say, we want to do this thing, answer these questions, qualify yourself. We're going to have 1 or 2 or 5 of you run a proof of concept for a determined period of time that's written out in the bid. And at the end of it, at the award area section, at the end of the proof of concept is when we award. So essentially, it's still following the letter of the law, but allows IT to do proofs of concept. And there was a couple other, bid types as well that we created around, making sure that we're acting within the letter of the law, but still being agile and creative enough to, think a little bit. I hate using that term, outside the box, but it kind of is. It's like we're thinking inside the law, but very creatively in that, so we can make all of our customers as happy as possible.
Well, that's excellent. When people get uncomfortable about doing things that are, maybe create something that hasn't been before,
Mm-hmm.
I tend to fall on the ground that if you're communicating to all of the vendors what the rules of the game are and how they play, and it's not on its face illegal, then it's something that you can try, right? Just because
Yep.
it's different doesn't mean that it's not okay. And I've seen in the past, on some of the data center bids that I've seen, they have a second phase in the bid where they allow the 2 most winning vendors to come inside for a period of time to validate their assumptions, and they have a period that is an extended sort of interaction point for the purpose of then making the decision. So what you described kind of reminded me of what I've seen for that, but that's fantastic that you've created that kind of structure. Not to put you on the spot, do you have an example of when you've done one of those or tried to make use of that kind of an instrument?
Competitive proof of concept.
Right.
Yeah, actually, there's it was recently for a cloud-based, I think it was Google Cloud, and they were looking at Google and Microsoft and Amazon services. So they basically wanted to try out all 3 for a cloud-based solution, to see who could handle it the best. And they landed on one for the majority of the work, and actually gave some of the work to another one, just a smaller piece of it. But it allowed them to see kind of real world how their cloud solutions would, work with our environment, what we had to do. So
Okay.
that's probably the most recent one in the last few months.
Well, I think it's a rule that if I have an interview with a procurement officer, I have to ask about COVID stuff, right? Because that's where we're all at, right? So what
Sure.
role does Michigan have with the ongoing COVID, and how have you kind of managed to absorb this new responsibility along with all the other normal responsibilities that you had coming into this period?
Yeah. So, not to beat the issue to death, but obviously we had a major shortage of PPE of all types for quite some time. And it was a struggle for us and a lot of other states and a lot of other countries to get what they needed. We were able to come through that pretty well. The first thing we did, again, going back to your kind of theme of being agile, we took a subset of our sourcing staff and said, look, your job is now sourcing PPE. And we pushed their projects to the rest of the sourcing staff that was still doing the day-to-day operation of the department. We still had to do strategic sourcing and procurement. So we had this what we call the triage team, and our triage team worked unbelievable hours for weeks and weeks and weeks to try and get our PPE. So we created some kind of micro processes and within that team in terms of how do we expedite purchase orders, how do we expedite wire transfers, and we fixed all that kind of within the first week. And so after that first week of, figuring out what the mechanics were of getting these vendors paid, because as everybody knows who's listening to this, that was a big issue as well, as getting vendors paid, net zero wire transfer, 50%, 100% upfront payment, millions of dollars. Having all those approvals in place, and then having the ability to do that within 15 or 20 minutes of getting a quote, was huge for us. So having a small subset of people heavily concentrated on the work, if you spread it out too much, then you're not going to get it done. And then the ability to kind of push those purchases really quickly through the system. And on the flip side, I'm not going to linger on it too much, but also to recall some of those purchases where fraud may have been occurring. Even a suspected fraud, we were able to really quickly recall wires and other monies. And therefore, I think we lost a total of $45,000 out of 260 million that we spent on PPE. So we're really proud of that. So, and then going forward, so on the PPE front, we're in good shape right now. We have more than I think we could use in the next year or more. I think we're positioned pretty well for, the continuing, outbreak. And on the vaccine side, we don't have a huge role in it. We are doing some support work in terms of buying some deep freezes and for storage, long-term storage, and also, dry ice for transport, and hiring, some transport companies that can move this. But federal level, really, that responsibility has fallen kind of to the National Guard. We're kind of letting them take the lead, and we're happy to do that on distributing the vaccine. It's not something really the state, I think, wanted to kind of lead.
Right.
So
let me close out by bringing it back to your team. So I wrote an article I extended an article last week where a writer out of the writing in the Harvard Business Review had talked about how kind of up through the late summer, we were still all responding with a certain amount of adrenaline. And then at some point in the fall and in the go forward, the adrenaline falls off, and you have to maintain that psychological stamina of your team and find ways to keep them energized, because while the light is at the end of the tunnel, we don't know how long the tunnel is. So how do you think about keeping your team kind of energized into the next year? And since you're we're doing this interview on the first day after the new year, as we start to really kind of step into 2021, what are some of the things you want to try to emphasize in this work year?
So I think that going through this pandemic was a very personal thing for a lot of people. So not only were people struggling with work, they're struggling with loved ones, they're struggling with children at home, spouses at home, learning to work remotely. And then you add on this pressure of having to do the job that we had to do. The first thing I would say is, I jumped in with my team as much as I could, and said, look, what is my role going to be in this? I'm not just going to be kind of the figurehead or the person planning or pulling strings. So, my specific role during this was handling the whole wire transfer piece. So my staff would hand off purchases over to me after a certain point, and then I would run it to the very end and then follow up and make sure that those things were being delivered, et cetera. So jumping in and supporting your staff is huge. Being there for them, I think on a personal level and a professional level is very important. I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for everyone on my team. I feel like I've built an amazing team, and I've done that very personally. I interview everybody that comes into our doors, one-on-one before they get the opportunity to work in my department. And that making sure that people are okay. And they're comfortable telling you that they're not okay. There were several occasions where I would send an email to someone. I'm like, hey, can you handle this? And they'd reply and say, no, I can't handle it. I've got too much going on. And my response was, okay, then I'll handle it, or I'll get someone else to do it. Telling them that, they're going to be okay and then it's going to end. Giving them comp time, time off. Say, hey, if you've got the time to take today, just take it off, and you don't need to log that time as a PTO day in the HR system. Just, you've earned this comp time, just go and spend time with your family. And not questioning that, not being a clock puncher. All those things go a very, very long way with folks. And so that's how I handled it. And folks, we had a lot of strained moments and some tears and some yelling, and was, not yelling at each other, but just frustration of, our vendors. And I can't believe this is happening. I'm sorry that this, I had masks and now I don't, that type of thing. Yeah, so I guess hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. And then how do you look into 2021? Do your priorities stay the same? Is there any particular difference in stuff that you're going to be working or trying to do in 2021 compared to now, or is it too early to know that?
No, it's not too early. I mean, we start looking at goals. We looked at our goals from 2020 a couple of weeks ago, before the holiday, and say, look, what got pushed aside because of COVID, and what are we going to pull forward then into 2021? So there was, probably 8 out of 25 goals that we probably are going to pull forward in 21 that just simply didn't get done. But otherwise, I'd say this year we're going to be more or less business as usual again. And with the exception of the fact that, and I think this is one good thing that has come out of COVID, and hopefully other people will agree with me, is the importance of a work-life balance where, having to be in the office or sitting like butt in seat doesn't mean that's automatic productivity. We're going to be in the office probably 2 days a week in person instead of 5. We're going to shrink our office space and save, a couple $100,000 a year on office space and supplies and whatnot. People like being at home a lot. They like being in the office too, but people are saving money on gas. They're saving money on childcare. They've, at this point, figured out all those speed bumps, smooth them over that kind of started out early in the process of working at home. So we've got a lot of positive coming out of this. So I think that our normalcy is going to be kind of exciting going into 2021 when we do return to the office. But in terms of our workload and the things that we're going to be looking at, it's going to be a lot of what we started out as in 2020, watching our KPIs, looking at savings, making sure we get the best people on our staff where we have open positions, all those types of things.
Right. And, I heard on one of the, I attended several virtual conferences this year, and one of the speakers was talking about how, our old language about work from the office or work from home actually then kind of morphs into work from anywhere, right? That it's a blend of the two, and there is that transition in being able to do it. But I think that concept of work from anywhere, and then how does that survive into 2020 or 2021 as things even out, is going to be an interesting change for a lot of procurement shops.
Absolutely.
Well, good. Hey, well, Jim, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it, and enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely, me too, Dustin. You take care, man.
Okay, thanks so much. Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.